Welcome back. In the last talk we did, we spoke about organization culture and Alkoomi's insights into what that actually means and looks like. But one thing we said was that the predominant influencer on organization culture is how leaders show up for the people in that organization. So it seems natural then that as we progress with these talks, it would be good now to talk about what is Alkoomi's take on what leadership means overall. We can go into detail in subsequent talks, but just to take a look at it overall. So leadership is, in fact, I really would like to talk about extraordinary leadership, not just leadership. But first to say, all people are leading. We're leading in our own lives, we're leading in our families, we're leading in our organizations. We're all leading. We just sometimes don't realize it, nor do we know where we're leading to. So it's really important to start with extraordinary leaders are real clear about where they're leading to. So it's also about delivering extraordinary results and understanding what those extraordinary results look like. But in terms of looking at leadership, we've looked at three main sources of understanding what leadership looks like. So we've looked at all the research on extraordinary leaders. We've read biographies, and we've got a shelf here full of biographies on extraordinary leaders. What do I mean by that? I mean by people who've led organizations, great and small, to deliver extraordinary results. People from Alexander the Great to modern leaders such as Bill Gates, Greta Thunberg, Vladimir Zelensky, Steve Jobs, etc., etc. You name some of those for yourself. And even in recent leaders in sport, such as Alex Ferguson, Gareth Southgate, and Clive Woodward, all these people have something to say about leadership and how they accomplished what they accomplished in leading organizations to deliver that extraordinary result. We've also combined that research into people who have been leaders to research by academics and practitioners, etc. People such as Gardner, Kaplan, Welsh, Reed, Abib Presh is particularly interesting, Heifetz, and many more. But it's actually, and also about simply asking the question of people in workshops. We've got some extraordinary feedback by just asking the question in workshops, who would you follow? What is it about people that would have you be a follower? Of course, the next question we ask is, how can you be that leader? But that's the subject of the workshop, and I'll come back to that on a later date. It's a combination of these three things that have led us to believe and see where we are about what extraordinary leadership looks like. But we constantly remain students. I'm often asked, who really is Alkoomi? And I don't mean flippantly, but it can sound glib. What I say is, we continue to be students in leadership. But you say, you're supposed to be the experts. Well, let me say something about that. I think all there is to know about leadership and its influence over people's behavior and the delivery of extraordinary outcomes could be represented by all the water, let's say, in the Pacific Ocean. And I think we're only about 6 inches down in the depth of our understanding of the power of leadership to make a difference. But there are some overriding principles that actually go counter to common thinking, some of them, that I'd just like to talk about, if I may, for a minute or two. First, anyone can lead. They just have to choose to do so. And the source of that leadership I'll discuss later, but you just have to choose to lead. I often hear people say there are natural leaders, and absolutely there are. There seem to be people that people naturally look to for leadership. It's kind of interesting because when you ask a question of a large group of people in an organization, it's really interesting to look at who they look to first before they answer, or who they look to actually give the answer on their behalf amongst them. And that sometimes gives you some insight into those people who show up as leaders for them. Secondly, It seems that extraordinary leadership has little to do with age and experience. For instance, Alexander the Great was just about 19, I think, when he left Asia Minor to head towards Persia. Because he left with 5,000 people and arrived with 45,000 people only a few years later. Also, people like Greta Thunberg. And then that's versus people like Churchill, who were obviously much older. And many people would have looked at his age at the time and thought he was beyond that career of leading a nation in wartime. It doesn't seem to be age dependent. The third thing is, there doesn't seem to be any particular style of leadership that works consistently. It's most often what we see is just someone being themselves and letting people see the great human being that they are. Everyone we have looked at had some similarities in their leadership, but none have had the same overall style. I mean, let me give you an example. Let's go back to Churchill and compare him with Gandhi. And I don't think anyone can tell me that the style of leadership that Gandhi demonstrated and the style of leadership that Churchill demonstrated had very much in common. Yet few people can argue that either of them wasn't an extraordinary leader over the organizations they led. Extraordinary leadership seems to be about development, not training. You know, it's who we're being and getting an insight into who we are and having that come through, including our vulnerabilities and the imperfections we have. All of the leaders we've looked at were far from perfect and with many imperfections. The one leadership we attribute that we observed all the leaders possessed, though, going all the way back to the beginning and right the way through, is this deep commitment to the future being different to what would be predictable if they did not intervene. For example, Richard Branson and the breaking of the monopoly of the major airlines over the Atlantic, or Gandhi and his commitment to breaking the link with the Raj and the British government and getting independence. And if you look at all those leaders, right at the very heart of who they were was this commitment to a different future. In safety, this deep dissatisfaction plays out as a deep dissatisfaction with the predictable future that will somehow get better at taking care of people, but with the realization that at the same time will continue to harm and hurt people physically and mentally. So incremental improvement doesn't seem to be the future that we really look for when we look for an extraordinary future. What we've also seen is the stronger the commitment, the more extraordinary the outcome. It's worth mentioning that another attribute that pretty well all those leaders had was a real deep care and concern for the people they aspired to lead. This can't be judged in contemporary terms, but in the context of the time they were leading, they were certainly ahead of the curve in the way they took care of their people. Let me give you an example. Napoleon regularly went and ate the meal around the campfire with his common soldiers. Why did he do that? Well, some of it was to make sure that they were getting enough food to continue the journey to Moscow and that they weren't going to collapse with hunger. But the other was to demonstrate to them that he was interested in their well-being and have them see that he actually cared. Extraordinary leadership is not a destination, it's a journey of life. Some of the people that we've set out on this journey with us are still coming back 10, 15 years later, telling us that they had new insights into what their leadership could be. And in fact, it's a bit like, I often describe this as a bit like climbing the Welsh hills. When you look up from Hay on Wye, the challenge of the Welsh hills seems like that first hill. And you set out committing to get to the top. And once you get to the top, what do you see? Yeah, you're right. More hills, different hills. And let me relate this with a story, if I may. we did some work on a major infrastructure project across the east of London. And the project director, the leader of that, went through a program with us of leadership development, commitment, and creating an extraordinary future around the safety and well-being of people. What he told us just a few months after, in a meeting with the rest of his team, was that morning, or a few mornings before, he'd got a new insight into what leadership really meant. He'd got to the end of his road. It was dark. It was pouring with rain. It was very early in the morning, middle of winter. And always he'd turned right at that junction on a blind bend across the traffic, in order to save, he said, about a minute in getting to the same roundabout as if he'd turned left. That morning he sat there thinking about this, and he declared that he'd never turned right again. He now turns left, and he'll turn left every time. He called it his light bulb moment. Even in those moments when we're on our own, confronting a situation, the choices we make tell us how deep our leadership really is, when no one else is watching. Kind of like, what's the score you put on your golf card when you're the only one in the bushes knowing how many times you swung the club to get it out of there? There's something about what he said was, leadership can't be when I put my hat on, my hard hat, when I start work in the morning, and finish when I take my hard hat on at night. It has to be who I am 24 hours a day. Although we've developed at this time 8 attributes of leadership that get confirmed and questioned every day in workshops and our research, and we're just constantly curious about that, but it's 8 at this time. Those 8 can be summarized up into what we call the 4 C's of leadership. The first C is committed, a commitment to the future being different to what would be expected if they did not intervene. A heartfelt, deep core commitment. Caring for the people that we aspire to lead, not just physically, but also taking care holistically of their well-being, their careers, taking care of their self-esteem by listening to their contribution and, where we can, acting on what they suggest and what they put forward as solutions. Being curious, constantly curious. I love the expression, when I stand in my ignorance, I'm a magnet for everybody else's expertise, knowledge, and curiosity. Even with, like me, 40 years of experience, if I've got 12 people in front of me, their experience and knowledge is going to far exceed mine. And finally, the 4th C, courageous. Having the courage to make the right choice over the expedient decision. I think you all know what I mean. We'll say more about the attributes, all the 8 attributes, in following talks to camera. But in the meantime, if you want to know more about what Alkoomi mean by extraordinary leadership and want to understand it more with us, you can follow us on LinkedIn, or you can get in touch with us anytime and we'll be happy to talk to you. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this insightful, and I look forward to our next talk.